Hello, I am Debbie McKeever, founder and owner of Strong and Healthy Temple. Welcome to my YouTube channel and welcome back to my series on mastering your mind in the wilderness season. This is part 7. And in this part, I wanted to talk about a couple of widows' experiences with the two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and also the Shunammite woman and her experience with Elisha. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about Elijah and his own wilderness experience. And again, I will be relating these to our own mindsets. So I'll start with Elijah and the widow of Zarephath in First Kings. And this takes place right after Elijah pronounces to the evil king Ahab, who is married to the wicked woman Jezebel, that there won't be any rain in the land until he commands it. God is working through this great prophet. So he has, stopped the rain from falling. So all of a sudden there is a famine in the land. And God sends Elijah out to Zarephath, and during this experience, he is having like a raven to feed him, and having this brook that has water in it so that he can eat and drink. And so anyway, when all that dries up, he runs into this widow in Zarephath, and he asks her to bring him a cup of water. And keep in mind that there's a famine, going on at this particular time. And she goes to get him a cup of water, and he says one more thing interesting to her. He tells her, to also bring him a piece of bread. And so this woman is gathering sticks when she finds him, and she says to him, that she swears by God that, she doesn't have any bread. She says, I only have, just a little ball of flour and a little bit of oil in the bottom of a jar. And it's just enough for my son and I, and we're going to eat this as our last meal, and then we're going to die. So basically, she was planning for them to die from starvation. And so Elijah says something interesting to her. He tells her, before you make this last meal for you and your son, bring me make a small piece of cake for me first. Now here's this woman, her and her son are obviously, on the brink of starvation, and she's about to cook like the very last meal, and here's this man who's asking for some of it. And so that's an example again of God giving us illogical instructions when we're going through, our dry season. Of the little that you have, here goes God expecting for you to give a little to somebody else first, who may be in an even worse predicament than you are. And that's how I want to relate that. And so, in the back of our minds, we're probably thinking, well, I don't really have anything myself. Here I am on my last, basically preparing to not necessarily physically die, but just, give up. I'm about to lose it all. I'm down to my last. How am I supposed to give anything to anybody else? And so, the widow represents, our developed thinking, where we're prepared to receive instructions from God. And so what she does is that she follows the word of the man of God. And he had neglected to mention that he had also promised her that if she did this, that she would never she and her son would never run out of food to eat. And so she followed his instructions. She trusted God. And sure enough, the bin of flour never ran out, and neither did the oil. They had, they miraculously had like this endless supply of food to eat, so they didn't have to worry about starving and dying. And so that's how we have to be in our dry season, when God gives us like these illogical instructions, which may include, giving of what little we do have, whether that be time, money, resources, whatever it is, we have to be, obedient to follow those instructions. And sure enough, miraculous things will happen. Well, what happened after that is that sometime after, her son became sick and he ended up dying. And so, after this, this big miracle had taken place, all of a sudden here's this, this dead thing, in her life. Same thing with us. Sometimes, God will do miraculous things in our lives, and we're just in this high place where we're praising and worshiping God and we're trusting God, to the fullest, and then all of a sudden, here comes this this thing in our lives that just disrupts, everything good that's going on. And so all of a sudden, she's crying out to the man of God and saying, what did I do to deserve this? Have my sins, come back to haunt me? And so a lot of times that's where we are in our mindsets, is that we suddenly forget, these miraculous things that God has just done for us, and then our focus is on, this one thing that comes along in our lives, to shake us up. We forget the wonders of God, just that quick. So anyway, long story short, Elijah ends up, he tells her to lie her son on the bed, and he ends up, crying out to God, and he lays himself over the child, and he breathes life back into the child and gives the child, back to his mother. And so, she's thankful and she's worshiping God. And that's the same thing with us, is that, God is always the same. God does not change. And just because something comes along, to disrupt us, even when we're having, this season of miracles, if we have a dead situation in our lives, God is able to breathe life back into our situations. And so I want to move along, at this point, to Elijah's own experience of the wilderness. After he leaves the widow of Zarephath, he goes back to deal with King Ahab and his evil wife Jezebel. And he challenges Ahab to bring out all the prophets of Baal, all the evil prophets that are worshiping, demon worshipers and those kinds of things. And he challenges them that if Baal is God, then he'll be able to bring fire down from heaven. But if the God that I believe in, if that's God, he'll bring fire down from heaven. And so they, set up these sacrifices, and he asked them to go first, because Jezebel basically had already slayed all of the prophets of God. If you read in 1 Kings, you'll see where she had slayed the prophets of God. And one of her servants, who was obedient to God, he actually ended up hiding about 100 of them, which I don't think that Elijah knew about. But anyway, so he got all those 450 prophets out, and he was the only one that was left of the prophets of God, to his knowledge. And they had been trying to call fire down from heaven in an unsuccessful manner. And long story short, Elijah called on God, and he kind of showed off a little bit. He put water in his trough and everything, and fire came down from heaven and burned up the sacrifice, licked up all the water. And so then the people who had turned away from God, fell on their faces and came back to God and started worshiping God again. And so Elijah had summoned them to gather up the prophets of Baal, and he took them and he killed all of Jezebel's prophets, basically. And so when Jezebel found out that Elijah had killed all of her prophets, she threatened his life. She told him that she was going to kill him. This woman was like, she was a witch. And so here is a man who had stopped the rains, who had called down fire from heaven, brought somebody back to life. He had, God had worked all these miraculous wonders through this man, and he let this woman who was a witch scare him off. And so he ended up running for his life and going and hiding in a cave for 40 days and 40 nights. And a lot of times that's how we do, is again, we forget all of the wonders that God has already worked through us, and one little threat, one little opposition comes along, and we focus on that one little threat, and we forget about all the wonders of God. We make that one thing bigger than our God, instead of remembering how big our God is. And that's what Elijah had done. So at the end of that 40 days and 40 nights, when he got done throwing his pity party and feeling like he was the only prophet of God left, God had called him out of the cave and told him that he was going to present himself to him. And this part is very interesting, because Elijah had looked for God through all of these great wonders. He looked for God in the storm, and he looked for God in the earthquake, and he looked for God in the fire. And God had not presented himself in any of these magnanimous ways. And all of a sudden he hears this still small voice. There is God in the still small voice. It is the same with us. A lot of times when we're going through things, particularly mentally, we're looking for these, for these big signs from God, or we're looking, at all these external sources, for help or advice, or, as our resource or as our source or what have you. And where is God? God is in the still small voice. We forget to get still and go within and listen for the still small voice. So once Elijah listened for the still small voice, there God was. Long story short, God sent him out to anoint new kings of Israel, along with another king he had sent him out to anoint. And also he had sent him to anoint his successor, Elisha. And of course, if you've read it, you know that Elijah did not face death. He actually had gotten taken up in a whirlwind. So he just kind of transitioned out without physical death. And so with that being said, I will fast forward to Elisha's experience with one of the widows of the prophets. And this was one of his fellow prophets, and he had passed away, and his widow came to Elisha and let him know, you know that my husband was a good man, but he had a lot of debt. And so now the creditors are threatening me, and they're threatening to, take my sons away from me. They were going to take her sons away from her, for the debt that her husband owed. And I think they were going to put him in jail. And so Elisha says something very interesting to the widow. He says, "What do you have in your house?" And so, and in that instance, he was talking about, her physical house. But as it relates to us and our mindsets, the house represents our bodies. Like, don't forget what's inside of you. What do you have in your house? Goes back to the still small voice. What lies within? What is the power that is within you that can get you out of this situation? Because she was in a situation where something was going to be taken away, and we could be in a situation like that where something is going to be taken away from us. And it's kind of hard to think rationally when you're going through things, and that's the whole purpose of shifting your mindset and working on your mindset on a daily basis, so you can get to that point that you have the peace that surpasses all understanding, and that even in tumultuous times you can get still and go within and hear from God, so that you're not, looking all outside of yourself and panicking. And because when you're panicking, obviously you cannot receive divine instructions. And also I want to point out too that, there could be something physically in your house. It could be something that you're hoarding. Say if it's a financial situation that's worth a lot of money, and if you sit still long enough, you'll get instructions of, what about that so and so? Maybe it's an expensive designer bag or something that you bought, years ago that you don't use anymore, and now it's considered vintage, and you put it on eBay and somebody's willing to pay like 5 times the price, and so now you've got the money to clear this debt, just using that as an example. So moving along in Elisha's after he asked her what she had in her house, she said that she had just a little bit of oil in the house. And so of course oil represents joy, and it also represents anointing. And so he told her to go out and to borrow a bunch of vessels, empty vessels, from all of her friends. And she went out, she had her sons to go out and borrowed up a bunch of vessels, and he told her to pour the oil into all the vessels. And so there was like a special anointing on the oil once they borrowed all the empty vessels, even though she just had a little bit. There was those illogical instructions again. And so she filled up all of the vessels, and he had told her to shut the door behind her. And once they filled up all of the vessels, he told her to go and sell all the oil and pay off the debt. And so she was able to pay off the debt. And so again, that represents, going within and receiving the divine instructions that will get us out of the situation that we're in, because she followed the instructions from God, from the man of God, and borrowed the empty vessels, even though it didn't make sense that, just a little bit of oil was going to fill up all those vessels. It did, and she was able to pay off of her debt. So fast forwarding to Elisha's experience with the Shunammite woman. And the Shunammite woman was, she had been giving Elisha room and board, every time he was in her area. Her and her husband had been giving him room and board and food and things like that. And so he wanted to reward her. And so he was talking to his servant Gehazi about her. And Gehazi mentioned to Elisha that, the Shunammite woman didn't have any children, and so he told her that he was going to have God to grant her a child, as a gift, even though she didn't want anything from him. And so she did. He told her she would be, have the child this time next year. And so she did. She ended up having the child. It was a miracle because her husband was very old in age, and he wasn't virile anymore, and so technically couldn't produce any children. But by the wonders of God, they were able to have the son. And so it happened one day that the father was out in the field, and the little boy went out, and he had a headache, and his head was hurting really bad. He was probably having like an aneurysm or something. But he went inside and sat on his mother's lap, and he died in his mother's lap by like noon that day. And so what that represents is, the dead child represents, again, that dead situation in our lives. We've had this miraculous thing to happen, and now, we've got like this dead situation in our life. So it's up to us, are we going to look at our circumstances, or are we going to focus on God? And so in this case, the Shunammite woman decided to put her focus on believing that the child would live. As far as she was concerned, he was just asleep. And so she set out to go see Elisha, and when he asked her how everything was, she said something interesting. She said, all is well. This is a woman who was not considering her circumstances. And so a lot of times when we've got things that are going on in our lives, or we have situations that seem like dead situations, or bad situations, or situations that we feel like can't possibly turn around, we're focused on the problem, or focused on the situation, instead of focusing on God. And in this woman's case, she was focused on God and her belief that her son could come back to life. And so Elijah has sent his servant Gehazi ahead of him. He like sent him ahead of him with his staff, and Gehazi was unable to bring the child back to life. And so, once Elijah got there, Elijah was able to, lie on the child, similar to what Elijah had done, and brought life back to the child and gave the child back to his mother. And so, because her focus was not on the situation, because her focus was on the deliverance, her child was brought back to life. And so I said all that to say, that's where we have to be, in our mindsets. We have to get to the point that no matter what we are believing for, that circumstances don't matter. No matter what it looks like, even when it looks like it's dead, we just have to believe that it's asleep, and that it will awaken, or that life can be brought back to that dead situation, just like the Shunammite woman, and just like the widow of Zarephath, and just like the woman, the widow who owed all the debt. We have to believe that God can bring life to our situation. So anyway, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I would love for you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, share the video with your network. Thank you so much for watching. Make it a great day.